But I think it's important within for people to understand a couple of things about the church. For one, is, and especially the Black church specifically here, is that what you ultimately have, especially with the Black church tradition, is a couple of things. One, it's important for people to understand that Christianity is by no means a white man's religion. That it thrived most within North Africa. And the greatest church fathers of the Christian tradition were actually Black Africans, whether we're talking about Augustine, Athanasius, Origen. I mean, the list just goes on. And what whiteness has done in its pursuit of power, because faith is power, being able to control people's, or be a spiritual leader, or having spiritual authority, is absolutely a kind of power. I would argue it's one of the most significant kind of power, because entrusting someone with your soul and then having that betrayed is profoundly traumatic. And so there must be greater pursuit of mental health awareness and those kinds of things for ministers and soul care providers, because they're operating within a sacred realm that has profound implications on individuals' emotions and psychology and all those kinds of things. And going back to what I was saying, so understanding that historically the church, in its greatest moment, and of course we know that Jesus wasn't Black, he was Middle Eastern, the apostles were Middle Eastern Jews, and then of course the North African church was made up of mostly influential Africans. And then what you end up having is, when we think about slavery and people coming to America, well, the typical narrative is that all the slaves came here, tabula rasa, no kind of faith system and everything else. We don't hear that Christianity was already widespread over Africa when slaves were brought here, abducted and brought here. There were African slaves who were Christians who came here in 1619. But what ultimately ends up happening is that religious power was used to oppress, to manipulate, to justify rape, pillage, murder, kidnapping, and a host of other evils. And then you have the colonization of faith, where you have Jesus being made white, church fathers being made white. You have the whiteness being, Christianity being baptized in whiteness, essentially. And that's the beginning of, I guess you could say, the American Black church tradition. But the interesting thing that happens is that once the slaves were liberated, white people were like, okay, so let's continue on. And Black folks was like, nah, we out. We're gonna start our own thing. We're gonna start our own churches. You had us chained to your pews. Why are we gonna stay here? And so they bounced. But this is an important point to recognize, is that when they bounced as descendants of the African diaspora, when they bounced, they did not have the economics or the faith tradition knowledge when they established the Black American church. The history of church writings, of traditions, and all those kinds of things, they did not have. They had to start from the beginning. And that information was withheld from them, from the white church. And again, it was already baptized in whiteness and white supremacy and all those kinds of things. And so for the first 150 years of the Black church tradition, what you have is a church that embraced faith in Christ, but also whose primary mode of operation, more or less, was caring for the traumatized. It was caring for the racially wounded and the racially traumatized. It did that based upon faith. It did it through the arts, whether it be music. If you listen to Black hymnody, in the music of Black hymnody, the hope that comes from Black Christian music, the dancing, the energy, all those kinds of things were various mechanisms of caring for traumatized individuals with very, very limited resources and very, very limited knowledge. And what you ultimately then have, moving into the 1950s, more or less, is, we can even go a little earlier than that, but you have the advent of the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel, which started off within the white tradition for manipulating poor whites, to then being embraced by certain Black pastors, and then becoming very prominent within Black church tradition. And you had this shift that took place from being the Black church being a refuge and the Black church being a haven and a medical aid, more or less, for the traumatized, to now being more about monetary gain and about trying to mirror the kind of success that white churches were flaunting. And if you're interested in a book that talks about this, Tabiti Anyabwile wrote a book called The Rise and Decline of African American Theology, subcaption From Biblical Faith to Cultural Captivity. He talks about this in that book. But I say, so all this is kind of prerequisite. I know I'm taking up some time now, but I want to lay all that out to say that when we come to understand the dynamics at play right now as it relates to mental health and the church, there's a reason why, kind of like with the same thing with rioting, there's a reason why the African American church has fallen more or less in regards to the its posture of being a place of refuge, and kind of embracing the more white expressions of faith, which is more Gnostic, as I mentioned earlier, which has rejected more of dynamics of mental health. That has not always been the case.